When Elena Morrison's 5 years of desperate prayers for motherhood seemed destined to go unanswered, a dying stranger appeared at her Montana homestead with a starving infant who would change everything. But as Elena discovers she can miraculously nurse the child back to health, the community brands her a kidnapper and threatens to tear apart the family she never expected to find. Will her newfound purpose as the Prairie Madonna be destroyed before she can prove that sometimes God's greatest gifts come through the most unexpected acts of grace? The church bell never rang at dawn, but Elena Morrison was always there anyway. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold wooden floor as she slipped through the heavy door, leaving her sleeping husband behind in their small cabin. The Montana Territory morning was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in the empty space. She dropped to her knees before the simple wooden cross, her nightgown pooling around her like spilled milk. Day 1825, she whispered to the shadows. 5 years of counting, 5 years of hoping, 5 years of watching other women in Stillwater Creek cradle babies, while her own arms remained forever empty. The candle she lit flickered in the November wind that crept through the gaps in the walls. Outside, she could hear the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of Daniel getting ready for another day of backbreaking work on their homestead. Soon he would call for her, expecting breakfast and a smile that grew harder to manage each morning. "I don't understand your plan," Elena continued, her voice barely louder than breathing. "Every woman in this territory has children except me. Even Mary Henderson, and she's near 50 years old." Her hands pressed against her flat stomach, the same gesture she'd made every morning for 5 years. "What am I doing wrong?" The wind picked up, rattling the single window so hard she thought it might break. Elena pulled her shawl tighter and closed her eyes, trying to feel something, anything that might tell her God was listening. But all she felt was the familiar ache of emptiness that had become her constant companion. When she finally stood to leave, her knees were stiff from the cold floor. The sun was just starting to peek over the mountains, painting the sky pink and orange like watercolor on wet paper. It should have been beautiful, but Elena barely noticed. She had work to do, a husband to feed, and another day of pretending her heart wasn't breaking to get through. Back at the cabin, Daniel was already dressed and pulling on his boots. He looked up when she entered, his kind eyes searching her face the way they did every morning. "How was your talk with the Lord?" he asked gently. "Same as always," Elena replied, moving to the stove to start breakfast. She could feel him watching her as she cracked eggs into the iron pan, the sizzling sound filling the silence between them. "Maybe today will be different," Daniel offered, but they both knew he was just being kind. They'd stopped talking about children months ago, the subject too painful for both of them. Elena nodded and forced a smile. Maybe. But as she watched the eggs cook, she wondered if she was fooling herself. Maybe some women just weren't meant to be mothers. Maybe her daily prayers were nothing more than whispers in the wind, heard by no one and changing nothing. The thought made her hands shake as she served Daniel his breakfast. He ate quietly, then kissed her forehead before heading out to check the fence line in the south pasture. Elena watched him go through the window, his shoulders already bent under the weight of another day's work. She was washing the breakfast dishes when she heard a sound that didn't belong in their quiet morning routine. Hoofbeats, coming fast and hard across the frozen ground. Elena dried her hands on her apron and stepped outside, shading her eyes against the bright morning sun. A rider was approaching from the tree line, hunched over his horse like he was hurt or exhausted. As he got closer, Elena could see his clothes were torn and dirty, his face pale with exhaustion, but it was the bundle in his arms that made her heart start racing. Something small and white, wrapped in what looked like a baby's blanket. The horse stumbled as it reached their yard, and the rider nearly fell from the saddle. Elena ran toward him, her feet slipping on the frost-covered grass. "Help!" the man gasped, his voice rough and desperate. "Please, I need help." Elena reached up as he slumped forward, and suddenly she was holding the bundle he'd been carrying. It was warm and surprisingly light, and when she pulled back the edge of the blanket, she saw a tiny face, a baby girl with dark hair and skin flushed with fever. "Oh my," Elena breathed, her arms automatically adjusting to cradle the child properly. The baby's breathing was quick and shallow, her little body much too warm. "My wife died 3 days ago," the man said, sliding down from his horse with obvious effort. "Fever took her fast. The baby won't take milk from a bottle. She's starving." Elena looked down at the infant in her arms, and something inside her chest cracked wide open. The baby's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, deep blue, like Daniel's before closing again with exhaustion. "What's her name?" Elena asked softly. "Rose," the man replied. "Like her mother. I'm Jacob Henley." He swayed on his feet, and Elena realized he was as sick and tired as his child. "Come inside," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "Both of you." As she turned toward the cabin, the baby stirred in her arms, making a soft sound that went straight to Elena's heart. After 5 years of empty arms and unanswered prayers, God had finally sent her a child, even if it wasn't the way she'd expected. The cabin felt different with strangers inside. Elena settled into her rocking chair by the fireplace, the baby Rose still cradled in her arms, while Jacob Henley sat at their kitchen table, looking like he might collapse at any moment. "When did she last eat?" Elena asked, gently touching the baby's forehead. The fever was concerning, but not as high as it had felt outside in the cold air. "Yesterday morning, I think," Jacob said, rubbing his face with shaking hands. "Maybe longer. Time's been hard to track." His voice broke on the last words, and Elena could see the grief written all over him like words on a page. She stood carefully, Rose still in her arms, and moved to the kitchen. "I'll try to get some water into her first. Babies can go without food longer than without water." The knowledge came from helping her sister with her 3 children, before life had taken Elena west to this lonely territory. But as she prepared a small cup with cooled water, something strange happened. Rose began to fuss, turning her head toward Elena's chest and making small, desperate sounds. Elena felt an odd tingling sensation, different from anything she'd experienced before. "She's looking for milk," Jacob said quietly. "She did the same thing with my wife. Before." He couldn't finish the sentence. Elena froze. The tingling sensation was getting stronger, and suddenly she understood what was happening. Her body was responding to the baby's need in a way that should have been impossible. "Mr. Henley," she said carefully, "I need you to step outside for a few minutes." He looked confused but stood anyway. "Is everything all right?" "I hope so," Elena replied, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Please, just give me some time alone with Rose." After Jacob stepped onto the porch, Elena sat back down in her rocking chair. Rose was becoming more agitated, her cries getting stronger, which was actually a good sign, Elena realized. A truly sick baby wouldn't have the energy to cry. With trembling hands, Elena loosened her dress. She'd heard stories from other women about milk coming in when it wasn't expected, usually after losing a baby. But she'd never been pregnant, never lost a child. There was no reason her body should know how to feed an infant, except when Rose latched on, it worked. Elena gasped at the sensation, tears streaming down her face as she felt the milk flowing. After 5 years of her body refusing to create life, it was suddenly providing exactly what this dying child needed. "Thank you," she whispered to the ceiling, to God, to whoever might be listening. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Rose settled immediately, her tiny fist curling around Elena's finger as she drank. The fever seemed to break almost instantly, and Elena could see color returning to the baby's cheeks. When Jacob knocked softly on the door 20 minutes later, Elena had composed herself enough to call him back inside. Rose was sleeping peacefully in her arms, looking healthier than she had since he'd arrived. "How did you?" Jacob started, then stopped, staring at the peaceful scene. "I don't know," Elena said honestly, "but it worked. She's taken milk, and her fever's breaking." Jacob sank into the chair across from her, his shoulders shaking with relief. I thought I was going to lose her too. I've been riding for 4 days, stopping at every homestead, but no one could help. Most places, they just sent me away. Elena understood why. A single man with a baby, claiming his wife was dead, it would sound suspicious to most folks. People in the territory were careful about strangers, especially ones with complicated stories. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "California. My brother has a ranch outside Sacramento. He wrote to me last year, said there was good land available for farming." Jacob's voice was steadier now, hope creeping back in. "But Rose, she's been getting weaker every day. I didn't think she'd survive the rest of the journey." Through the window, Elena could see Daniel riding back from the south pasture earlier than usual. He must have seen the strange horse in their yard and decided to investigate. Her stomach tightened as she realized she would have to explain this impossible situation. "My husband's coming back," she said. "Daniel's a good man, but this is unusual." Jacob nodded. "I understand if you can't help beyond today. What you've already done." He gestured at the sleeping baby. "It's more than I had any right to hope for." But Elena was already thinking ahead. Rose would need to eat again in a few hours. And again after that. Her body had somehow learned to provide what this child needed. But that miracle would be wasted if they sent Jacob on his way tomorrow. "Maybe you should stay the night," she heard herself saying. "Both of you. Make sure Rose is strong enough to travel." Jacob's eyes widened. "That's very generous, Mrs. Morrison, but I couldn't impose—" "Elena," she corrected him. "And it's not an imposition. It's what neighbors do." Even as she said the words, Elena knew she was stepping into dangerous territory. People in Stillwater Creek already whispered about her childlessness, about how it wasn't natural for a woman to go so long without children. Having a strange man and his baby in her home would start even more talk. But as Rose stirred in her arms, making a small, contented sound, Elena realized she didn't care what people said. For the first time in 5 years, she felt useful, needed, like she had a purpose beyond just existing from one empty day to the next. Daniel's boots sounded on the porch steps, and Elena took a deep breath. Whatever came next, she would face it with this miracle baby in her arms, and the knowledge that maybe, just maybe, her prayers had been answered after all. Just not the way she'd ever imagined they would be. Elena's body betrayed every doctor who had ever told her she was broken. As baby Rose's tiny mouth found her breast, warm milk flowed like a river that had been dammed for too long. The sensation sent shivers through her entire being. Not just physical, but something deeper, as if her soul was finally remembering its true purpose. "Sweet mercy," she whispered, staring down at the infant's peaceful face. Rose's cheeks, which had been sunken and gray just an hour before, already showed the faintest hint of pink. Her breathing had steadied from the desperate, shallow gasps that had terrified Elena when Jacob first placed her in her arms. Jacob sat frozen in the wooden chair across from her, his eyes wide with something between relief and wonder. I don't understand. How is this possible? You said you never had children." "I haven't." Elena's voice came out strange, almost like she was speaking in a dream. "But my body, it's like it was just waiting for her." The cabin felt different now, filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the stone fireplace. Outside, the November wind still howled across the Montana plains. But inside, time seemed to have slowed to match the rhythm of Rose's gentle suckling. Elena had always imagined what this moment might feel like, holding her own baby, feeling that rush of protective love she'd heard other women describe. But she'd never imagined it would happen like this, with a stranger's child, in circumstances that made no sense to her practical mind. Yet her heart understood perfectly. This was what she'd been praying for all along, just not in the way she'd expected. "Tell me about your wife," Elena said softly, partly to fill the silence, and partly because she needed to understand the woman who had given life to this precious child. Jacob's face crumpled slightly. Mary was. She was everything good in this world. Patient, kind, always humming some little song while she worked. She was so excited about the baby. His voice caught, She had names picked out for months before Rose was born. If it was a boy, she wanted to call him Samuel, after her father. But she always said she hoped for a girl, someone she could teach to braid flowers and bake bread. Elena looked down at Rose, trying to picture the woman who had carried her for 9 months, who had brought her into the world only to be taken away so suddenly. How did it happen? The fever? Started 3 days after we left our farm in Nebraska. We were heading west, looking for better land in California. Mary complained of feeling tired, but we thought it was just from traveling with a new baby. Jacob's hands clenched and unclenched in his lap. By the 2nd day, she was burning up. By the 3rd, he couldn't finish. Elena's heart ached for him, but also for Mary, who would never see her daughter take her first steps or speak her first words. She would be grateful, you know, that you found help for Rose. Would she? Jacob's voice was raw with doubt. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed, tried to find a doctor, instead of pushing west. Maybe if I'd made different choices. You can't think like that. Elena shifted Rose slightly, marveling at how natural the motion felt. You did what any father would do. You kept going until you found help. That's love, not failure. Rose made a small sound of contentment, and Elena felt her milk increase in response, as if her body had become perfectly attuned to this child's need. It was a miracle she couldn't explain and didn't want to question. The front door creaked open, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the sound of Daniel's boots stomping snow off on the wooden porch. Elena's husband appeared in the doorway, his weathered face taking in the scene with careful eyes. Daniel, Elena said, suddenly nervous. How could she possibly explain what was happening? But Daniel's expression wasn't angry or confused. Instead, he moved slowly into the room, his gaze fixed on the baby in her arms. Well, I'll be, he said quietly. Look at that little one. She's taken to you like you were her own mother. Dan, I can explain. No need to explain a blessing when you see one. Daniel hung his coat on the peg by the door and rolled up his sleeves. Mr. Henley, you look like you haven't eaten in days. Elena, you stay put with that baby. I'll fix us all some supper. Elena watched her husband move around their small kitchen, pulling out ingredients with the same steady calm he brought to everything in life. This was Daniel, practical, accepting, never one to waste time questioning good fortune when it appeared. But as Rose finished nursing and Elena began to gently pat her back, a new worry crept into her mind. What would happen when Jacob continued his journey to California? Would her body remember how to nourish a child? Or would this magical ability disappear as quickly as it had come? Jacob, she said, how long were you planning to stay? He looked up from where he'd been, staring into the fire. I thought, maybe just tonight? Let Rose get a good feeding and some rest before we push on? The weather's supposed to clear tomorrow. Elena felt her heart clench. One night, after 5 years of empty arms, she would have less than 24 hours with this baby, who had awakened something she'd thought was dead inside her. But maybe one night was enough. Maybe God was showing her that she wasn't broken after all, that her body knew how to be a mother even if her womb had never carried a child. Maybe that knowledge would be enough to sustain her through whatever came next. Rose chose that moment to let out a small burp, then settled against Elena's shoulder with a sigh of perfect contentment. Elena closed her eyes and breathed in the sweet scent of baby's skin and innocence, memorizing every detail of this moment. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The roosters had barely begun to crow when Margaret Caldwell's sharp voice cut through the morning air like an axe through kindling. Elena jerked awake in her rocking chair, where she'd spent the night with Rose sleeping peacefully in her arms, and felt her blood turn cold at the sound of multiple horses approaching their cabin. Elena Morrison, you come out here right now. Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone who believed God, spoke directly through her, and bring that child with you. Daniel was already at the window, peering through the curtains with a grim expression. There's 5 of them. Margaret, Pastor Williams, the Hendricks brothers, And he paused. Tom Bradley from the territorial office. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Tom Bradley only came around when there was official business, the kind that usually meant trouble for someone. She looked down at Rose, who was just beginning to stir, her tiny fists stretching above her head, in that way babies do when they're waking up hungry. "What do they want?" Jacob whispered, though they all knew the answer. Daniel opened the door before anyone could knock, his tall frame filling the doorway like a shield. "Morning, folks. Bit early for visiting, isn't it?" Margaret pushed past him without ceremony, her steel-gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent scowl. Her eyes immediately found Elena and the baby, and her mouth pursed like she'd tasted something sour. "Just as I suspected," she announced to the room. "Elena Morrison, you have overstepped every boundary of decent Christian behavior. Nursing another man's child while your own husband sleeps under the same roof as a stranger? The scandal of it." "Now hold on, Margaret." Daniel started, but she cut him off with a wave of her gloved hand. "Don't you now hold on me, Daniel Morrison. This situation is an affront to everything proper and godly. Pastor Williams agrees with me completely." The pastor, a thin man with kind eyes, who had always seemed uncomfortable with Margaret's pronouncements, shifted nervously in the doorway. "I merely said that the situation was unusual." "Unusual?" Margaret's voice rose to a pitch that made Rose flinch in Elena's arms. "A married woman abandoning her duties to play mother to some drifter's bastard child? That's not unusual, Pastor Williams. That's sinful." The word hit Elena like a slap. She stood slowly, holding Rose protectively against her chest. This baby was dying. Was I supposed to let her starve because it might cause gossip? You were supposed to send them on their way. Margaret snapped. "There are foundling homes, proper places for orphaned children, not the arms of a woman who clearly can't accept God's will for her own life." Tom Bradley finally stepped forward, removing his hat with obvious reluctance. Elena had known him since he'd taken the territorial position 3 years ago. He was a fair man, but weak when it came to standing up to people like Margaret. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, "Mrs. Caldwell has raised some concerns about the propriety of this arrangement, given that Mr. Henley here isn't family, and that you're caring for his child in such an intimate way." "Intimate?" Elena's voice was deadly quiet. "I'm feeding a hungry baby. There's nothing more natural in God's creation." "Natural for a baby's own mother," Margaret interjected. "Not for a woman who has clearly lost her mind with grief over her own childless state." The words hung in the air like poison. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from rage so pure it made her hands shake. This woman, who had borne 6 children of her own, dared to judge her for finally being able to do what every other woman in their community took for granted? "I think," Jacob said, stepping forward with careful politeness, "there's been a misunderstanding. Mrs. Morrison saved my daughter's life. Rose was dying, and now look at her." He gestured to the baby, whose cheeks had pinked up beautifully overnight. "How can anyone call that wrong?" "Because it's not the natural order," Margaret replied, her voice growing shrill. "Children belong with their blood kin, not with women who are so desperate to be mothers that they'll steal another woman's child." "Steal?" Elena's voice cracked like a whip. "I stole nothing. This man came to my door with a dying baby, and I did what any Christian woman would do. I helped. Any decent Christian woman would have found proper help. A wet nurse from town, a foundling home, something appropriate." Margaret's face was flushed with righteous anger. "Instead, you've created a situation that has the entire community talking. People are saying you've lost your mind, Elena. That grief has made you delusional." Pastor Williams cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we could discuss this calmly." "There's nothing to discuss." Margaret cut him off. "This situation ends now. Mr. Bradley, I demand you remove this child from Mrs. Morrison's care immediately. The woman is clearly not in her right mind." Tom Bradley looked deeply uncomfortable, his gaze shifting between Elena and Margaret. Well, I suppose, if there are concerns about the child's welfare. The child's welfare? Elena's voice rose. Look at her. She's healthy. She's gaining weight. She's content. How is that not in her welfare? But even as she spoke, Elena could see the doubt creeping into Tom Bradley's eyes. Margaret Caldwell had a way of making her version of events sound not just reasonable but inevitable. And Elena knew that her own reputation as the woman who couldn't have children, the woman who prayed too loudly, hoped too desperately, worked against her now. Mrs. Morrison, Tom said slowly, I'm going to have to ask you to turn the baby over to Mr. Henley. If he wants to make other arrangements for her care, that's his right as her father. Elena felt the world tilt around her. After everything, the miracle of being able to nurse Rose, the night of perfect contentment, the hope that had finally begun to bloom in her heart, it was all being ripped away because of fear and judgment. She looked at Jacob, desperate for him to speak up, to defend what they'd accomplished together. But his face was pale with uncertainty, and she realized that he was just as frightened as she was of these people with their official authority and righteous anger. Jacob, she whispered, tell them how she's improved. But Jacob was already stepping forward, his hands outstretched. Maybe it would be best if I took Rose now. I don't want any more trouble. Elena felt her heart shatter into pieces, so small she wasn't sure they could ever be put back together. After 12 hours of feeling like a real mother, she was about to lose the only child she'd ever been able to nourish. But as she looked down at Rose's sleeping face, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She was not giving up without a fight. A sharp knock echoed through the cabin at dawn, jolting Elena from her sleep. Rose stirred in her arms as heavy boots stomped across the wooden porch outside. Margaret Caldwell's voice cut through the morning air like a church bell, announcing trouble. Elena Morrison, you open this door right now. Elena's heart raced as she quickly wrapped her shawl around herself and the baby. Through the window, she could see not just Margaret, but 3 other women from town standing behind her. Their faces looked stern and disapproving in the pale morning light. Daniel was already at the door, his hand on the latch. What's this about, Margaret? You know exactly what this is about. Margaret snapped back. Her gray dress made her look like a storm cloud ready to burst. That woman is making a fool of herself and bringing shame on our whole community. Elena stepped forward, holding Rose protectively against her chest. The baby had grown stronger over the past few days, her cheeks now pink with health instead of the terrible pale color she'd had when Jacob first brought her. The baby was dying, Elena said quietly. I only did what any Christian woman would do. Any Christian woman would have sent that man on his way, replied Mary Henderson, Margaret's closest friend, her thin lips pressed together like a trap snapping shut. Instead, you've been playing house with a stranger while your own husband watches. Jacob emerged from the barn where he'd been sleeping. His clothes wrinkled from hay, but his eyes alert with worry. Ladies, I can explain. You don't need to explain anything to us, Margaret interrupted, pointing her finger at him like a weapon. We know exactly what's happening here. A man shows up with some story about a dead wife and a sick baby, and suddenly Elena Morrison thinks she's found her calling. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. Rose needed help. Look at her now. She's healthy and happy. How can that be wrong? Because it's not natural. Margaret's voice grew louder, causing the baby to whimper. God didn't bless you with children for a reason, Elena. You can't just steal someone else's baby and pretend it's yours. The words hit Elena like a slap across the face. She'd heard whispers like this before, but never spoken so boldly to her face. The other women nodded their agreement, their expressions cold and certain. She's not stealing anything, Jacob said, stepping closer to the group. My daughter was starving. Elena saved her life. Your daughter belongs with your family, said Ruth Palmer, the youngest of the women, not with some desperate woman who can't accept God's will for her life. Daniel moved to stand beside his wife, his jaw tight with anger. "I think you ladies have said enough." Margaret straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "We haven't even started, Daniel Morrison. The whole town is talking about this situation. People are saying Elena has lost her mind with grief over not having children. They're saying she's convinced herself this baby belongs to her." Elena looked down at Rose, who was now awake and looking up at her with bright, trusting eyes. The baby's tiny hand wrapped around Elena's finger, and she felt that fierce love surge through her again. "I know Rose isn't mine by blood," Elena said, her voice stronger now, "but she needs me, and I need her. Sometimes God works in ways we don't expect." "God works through proper channels," Margaret shot back. "Through family, through marriage, through the natural order of things, not through scandal and improper behavior." The women began to turn away, but Margaret paused at the edge of the porch. Her next words felt like ice water thrown over Elena's hopes. "Pastor Williams is calling a meeting tonight at the church. The whole community will be there to discuss this situation. We'll see what everyone else thinks about your arrangement." As the women walked away, their voices carried on the wind, already spreading more gossip and judgment. Elena sank into the rocking chair by the door, Rose still in her arms, while Daniel and Jacob exchanged worried looks. What would happen when the entire town decided her fate? The church felt different that evening, packed with neighbors who usually only gathered for Sunday services or weddings. Elena sat in the front row, Rose sleeping peacefully in her arms, while hushed conversations buzzed around them like angry bees. Pastor Williams stood at the front, his kind face troubled as he looked out over the crowd. Elena had always respected him, but tonight she couldn't read his expression. Would he support her or side with those calling for her to give up the baby? "Friends," the pastor began, his voice carrying easily through the small building, "we're here tonight to discuss a difficult situation that affects our whole community." Elena felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Some faces showed curiosity, others disapproval. A few looked sympathetic, but not many. "Elena Morrison has opened her home to a traveling man and his infant daughter," Pastor Williams continued. "Some of you feel this arrangement is inappropriate." Margaret Caldwell stood up from her seat in the third row. "It's more than inappropriate, Pastor. It's unseemly. A married woman nursing another man's child while he lives under her roof. What kind of example does this set for our young people?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Elena's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she kept her chin up. Dr. Peterson, the town's physician, raised his hand. "May I speak?" Pastor Williams nodded, and the elderly doctor stood slowly. "I examined this baby when she first arrived. She was severely malnourished and dehydrated. Without Elena's care, the child would have died within days." "That's not the point," Margaret argued. "The point is that Elena is overstepping her place. She's not this child's mother." "But she's acting like one," said a voice from the back. Elena turned to see Susan Wright, a young mother of 3, standing near the door. "I've seen how she cares for that baby. I've never seen a child look more loved or content." Elena felt a spark of hope, but it was quickly dampened by another voice. "Love isn't enough," called out Thomas Reed, one of the town's most successful ranchers. "This man needs to take his child and move on. Elena needs to accept that some women aren't meant to be mothers." The harsh words made Elena flinch, but then she felt Jacob's presence beside her. He had stood up, his face serious but determined. "My wife died 3 days after giving birth," Jacob said, his voice clear and strong. "She caught a fever and passed quickly. I tried to feed Rose with a bottle, but she couldn't keep anything down. I rode for days, desperate to find help." The church grew quiet as Jacob continued his story. "When I found Elena, my daughter was hours from death. I'm not exaggerating. Hours. Elena didn't hesitate to help, even though she'd never met us before. She saved Rose's life." "And where is this leading?" Margaret demanded. "Are you planning to stay here forever? Are you asking Elena to abandon her husband and run away with you?" Elena's heart pounded as she realized this was the moment of truth. Jacob looked at her, then at the crowd, then back at her again. Actually, Jacob said slowly, I've been thinking about that. My brother in California has been asking me to bring Rose to live with him and his wife. They have children of their own and could provide for her. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Jacob, what are you saying? He knelt down beside her chair, his eyes gentle but serious. I'm saying, maybe there's another way. Maybe you could come with us to California. Help me raise Rose properly. As my wife. The church erupted in shocked gasps and excited whispers. Elena stared at Jacob in amazement, while Daniel stood frozen beside her. Margaret's voice cut through the noise like a sword. This is exactly what I was afraid of. This man has bewitched Elena into abandoning her duties as a wife. But Elena wasn't listening to Margaret anymore. She was looking into Jacob's eyes, seeing the sincerity there, the hope, the promise of a life she'd never dared imagine. Could she really leave everything she'd ever known for the chance to be Rose's mother? The wagon wheels hit a deep hole, jolting Elena awake as baby Rose cried out in surprise. They had been traveling for 3 weeks now, and the December cold bit through every layer of clothing she wore. Jacob pulled the horses to a stop and jumped down to check the broken wheel. How bad is it? Elena asked, bouncing Rose gently to calm her. Jacob's face was grim as he knelt by the wagon. Bad enough. We'll need to find a blacksmith, or we're not going anywhere. Through the swirling snow, Elena could see smoke rising from a small town ahead. But something else caught her eye. Dark shapes moving fast across the white landscape behind them. Riders. Too many riders to be friendly traveler. Jacob, she whispered, pointing. He stood quickly, shading his eyes against the snow glare. 6 men, maybe 7. They're coming hard. Elena's heart started racing. She had feared this moment since they left Montana. What do we do? We run. Jacob was already unhitching the horses. Leave the wagon. Take only what we need. But Rose's blankets, her milk bottles. Elena! Jacob's voice cut through her panic. We go now, or we don't go at all. She grabbed the small bag of baby supplies and wrapped Rose tight against her chest. Jacob lifted her onto his horse, then swung up behind them. As they rode toward the town, Elena could hear shouting behind them. The voices were getting closer. There, Jacob pointed to a church steeple rising above the other buildings. Churches offer sanctuary. Maybe we can. A gunshot cracked through the cold air. Not aimed at them, but close enough to make the horses dance sideways. Elena held Rose tighter, feeling the baby's tiny heart beating against her own. The town was bigger than it had looked from far away. People stopped to stare as they galloped down the main street, their faces curious and worried. Elena saw women pulling their children closer, men stepping out of shops to watch. Jacob pulled up at the church steps. Go inside. I'll be right behind you. But as Elena climbed down, she saw something that made her blood turn cold. A man in a marshal's badge was walking toward them from across the street. And behind him came more riders, the ones who had been chasing them. Ma'am, the marshal called out in a voice that wasn't mean, but wasn't friendly either. I need you to step away from that baby. Elena's legs felt weak as she climbed the church steps. Rose still pressed against her chest. The heavy wooden doors opened before she could knock, and a young priest appeared, his kind eyes taking in the scene quickly. Father Murphy, the marshal called from the street. Don't interfere. This woman has taken a child that doesn't belong to her. Is that true? Father Murphy asked Elena quietly. The baby was dying, Elena said, her voice shaking. Her mother died, and she couldn't drink from bottles. I was the only one who could feed her. From behind the marshal, Elena heard a familiar voice that made her heart jump. That's my wife you're threatening. Daniel rode up on his tired horse, his face hard with anger Elena had never seen before. Behind him came Dr. Peterson from their town, and even Pastor Williams from their little church. Marshal Henderson, Dr. Peterson called out as he climbed down from his wagon. I've come a long way to tell you what really happened. The marshal looked confused now. Doctor? This baby was near death when I first saw her 3 weeks ago. This woman's milk saved her life. Look at the child now. Does she look stolen to you? Elena pulled back Rose's blanket so everyone could see. The baby was pink and healthy, her eyes bright and curious as she looked around at all the faces. I have papers, Jacob said, stepping forward with his hands up to show he meant no harm. Letters from my wife's sister in California, asking me to bring Rose to her. But the baby got sick on the trail. Elena Morrison saved her life. Margaret Caldwell pushed through the crowd, her face red with anger. That woman has lost her mind with wanting a baby. She stole this child. Mrs. Caldwell, Dr. Peterson said firmly, I delivered every baby born in our county for the last 10 years. I know what a sick child looks like, and I know what a healthy one looks like. This baby is thriving because of Elena's care, not despite it. The marshal looked from face to face, clearly trying to decide what was true. Father Murphy stepped closer to Elena. Perhaps, the priest said in his gentle voice, we should ask what's best for the child, not what makes us feel better about our rules. Rose chose that moment to smile up at Elena, her tiny hand curling around Elena's finger. The crowd grew quiet, watching. What would the marshal decide about their strange little family?